Welcome to you all listening to this new edition of our InIIS InSIGHTS series here at the University of Bremen. My name is Karadag. I'm a member of the Institute of Intercultural and International Studies, and I will moderate today's session. Some time has passed now since our last episode with Elisabetta Gaufmann from the University of Groningen. In March, the Russia-Ukraine war, the Russian invasion, still felt so fresh that one could barely believe, looking from the outside, at what kind of war was exactly unfolding there. And even now, 3 months into this war, it still feels weird, to be frank, in getting along with all those destructions in the Ukraine, but also with the global implications of this war. Its enormous fallout that hits everything from economic interdependencies, the reinvigoration of NATO and transatlantic politics, and then, of course, also the consequences of that reinvigoration. Let's take only the Finnish and Swedish ambitions to join NATO. This created a newest round of diplomatic escalations with Turkey, which tries to maximize its position vis-a-vis Western states. And this regards those Western states' reservations on points like arms sales, Western views on Kurdish organizations in the region and in Europe, and also Western reservations regarding the military interventions of the Turkish Air Force and the Turkish army in northern Iraq and northern Syria. And then we have, on the other front, European frustrations with countries like Hungary for not complying with the oil embargo that is supposed to target Russia. As we have many Western realizations now that there is no real collective international front against Russia out there, that Africa and Asia are split in their allegiances, and that there seems really no way to get big players like China and India along in the attempt to isolate Russia. And maybe this is all just one of the many battles between pro-Western and anti-Western camps in the 21st century. Struggles between the US and China. And at this point, it remains totally unclear to how to expect when and how this war will end, who will have won and who not. That the list of losers in this war and its global fallout is so long has to do with one specific dynamic, which is the manifold food dependencies on Russia and the Ukraine. These two are big export powerhouses with regard to wheat and maize, for example, which they export to many Middle Eastern and African countries. COVID had already disturbed the normal functioning of regional food markets. Then you have the disruptions in African economies and in value and commodity chains. There is the issue of the lack of remittances from Europe. So people in many countries already have had to adapt, have had to live with increasing food prices, which left many more people food insecure compared to the years before that. And now this war has even bigger repercussions for food prices in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, not just because wheat from the war regions does not get shipped and distributed, but also because there is heavy fluctuation and speculation with respect to foodstuff prices, speculation that has to operate with many delicate signals in this turbulent market. And then, of course, there's the increase in oil and gas prices and energy and transport, which again leads to more inflationary pressures and to more money being spent for flour, bread, meaning elementary nutrition for so many people out there. This is also very complex that we definitely need some guidance on the matter, and that is why we are so happy to have Eckart Woertz with us. Eckart Woertz is professor for modern history and politics in the Middle East at the University of Hamburg since 2019. He's also director of the Institute of Middle East Studies at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. And before that, he was, among other places, at the Gulf Research Center in Dubai until 2010, and senior researcher at the Barcelona Center for International Affairs until 2019. He has a PhD in economics, which he received in 1999 from Nuremberg Erlangen. And his research covers areas like the political economy of the Middle East, energy and food security, development, Gulf politics, etc. You will probably know him for his great 2013 book, Oil for Food, The Global Food Crisis and the Middle East, published with the Oxford University Press. And this was back then really something new and innovative in the field of German Middle East studies research. So if you have not, you should really read this wonderfully written book. And you should, of course, also engage with his later publications, which convincingly connect issues of geopolitics with political economy and agriculture and food. I also suggest that you read his latest GIGA focus, which came out just a couple of days ago, titled The Russian War Against Ukraine, Middle East Food Security at Risk, which you can access on the GIGA homepage. Eckart, thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, let me begin with this one. Can you think of any other conflict or war out there in these past decades that had such food implications on such an international scale?
Oh, many. Actually, the implications we have seen so far are rather tame compared to past wars. I mean, imagine World War II. 60% of Japanese casualties were not due to military action, but simple famine, once the US was able to cut supply lines in the Pacific. The terrible, atrocious hunger plan of the Germans in the Soviet Union that essentially envisaged starving to death about 30 million civilians in the Soviet Union, essentially eradicating the population of the newly industrialized cities in the Soviet Union. The only power that was not fighting on an empty stomach was the US, yeah? And prevented famines in allied nations like Great Britain. So compared to such orders of magnitude, yeah, the whole picture looks pretty tame so far. That doesn't mean that it's very concerning. Yeah? But if we look at past experiences of war and famine, if we turn to the Middle East, the naval blockade of the Entente forces led to the Great Syrian Famine in the First World War, with over 500,000 people perishing. You might know this famous movie with Fayrouz Safaberlik. Yeah, it's part of the collective memory to this day in Lebanon, how essentially, especially those areas in the Middle East that were dependent on export crops like mulberry trees and silk in the case of Lebanon, and we're not producing the food on site, and at the same time we're not only targeted by the Entente forces but also by export restrictions of the Ottomans from grain producing areas in the Hauran Mountains, for example, in the Hauran area of Syria, that these areas suffered most. So yeah, once again, compared to these past war experiences, what we are witnessing now is pretty tame. Of course, very concerning as well, but at the same time, we also have considerable international institutions in place that might be able to mitigate some of the impact. Yeah? I'm talking, for example, about the FAO, about the InIIS, the Agricultural Market Information System that was introduced after the global food crisis 2007 and 2008, and so on. We also have to see so far, basically, we went into this crisis with a stocks to use ratio in wheat that was better than in 2007 and 2008. Okay, there are some debates about how reliable the statistics of Chinese wheat stocks, globally the largest, really are. But overall, we seem to have at least a bit of a buffer. We went into this crisis with a buffer. So we will need to see how it develops and how we will be able to manage it, for example, also by enabling international relief organizations like the World Food Program, like assisting countries that are now really fiscally challenged, let's put it like that, countries like Egypt, the world's largest wheat importer, to pay for food, that now need to source food imports from elsewhere, Egypt received over 80%, about 85% of its wheat from Ukraine and Russia. So some of that they will need to source from elsewhere, and that will be more expensive. So there are programs or plans to assist countries like that, IMF, World Bank, and so on, to put them into a position to maintain such import programs at a hopefully affordable price.
You already referred to several points in your response here. Let me pick up on one broader point. So the issue of there being basically enough food that is produced on a yearly basis. I mean, there is this critique being uttered against how the global food system operates. So there seems to be enough food produced every year. But despite that, already in these past years before the war, and also a couple of years before the pandemic, you had this yearly critique that, well, if there's so much food out there, why does the number of people being food insecure not go down further than happened?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big story of the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, that it's never the food availability or the lack of food availability that causes a famine, but the lack of accessibility, that vulnerable segments of the population cannot afford food anymore. And as a result, actually, famine areas are typically food export areas, right? Because where does the food go? To the people who can pay for it. Yeah? So whether it's the Irish potato famine in the 19th century or the Bengal famine in the 1940s, the food is getting out of these areas, and unless the state does not intervene, with emergency relief and breaks the famine, people die. And this basic wisdom, that it's always food accessibility, and that's essentially a social problem and not some sort of technocratic problem or some sort of natural catastrophe that has come over us from outside of our social realm. That still holds also in that case. Yes. And do we have a problem in Germany with rising food prices? No, not really, right? And actually, only a very small part of the rising food prices is attributable to the actual commodity, right? Like your bowl of cereals, Kellogg's cornflakes or whatever. How much of that is really wheat? Yeah, I mean, it's the packaging, it's the advertising, it's the transportation, and so on. So while those people who are spending a much higher share of their disposable income on basic food items, where basically 50% of the wheat price is really a 50% increase of your spending on food, which already accounts for maybe 30-40%, 50% or even more of your discretionary spending. So these classes, for example, urban wage owners that then might also face other economic hardships, losing their jobs or so, they are most exposed.
Another sort of critique that is regularly brought up is the issue of food price speculation, and that speculation tends to so far disconnect from, well, basic statistics on production and also availability also. Now, if I remember your book correctly, you were not too critical in that book in the sense that it is that food price speculation, where the speculation drives most of the dynamic. Do you see a similar dynamic now?
I wouldn't overemphasize the role of speculation. First of all, it always has a kind of negative undertone, especially in Germany, whatever, romanticism, or I don't know what it is. Speculation is a natural thing and possibly a good thing, right? Farmers are interacting with speculators and essentially buying insurance. So there is this kind of good speculation by specialized providers of forward contracts that puts a farmer in a position to sell the harvest already in springtime to basically maintain his operation and have a certain security about his revenue position in the summer. Then there's, of course, also a bit the kind of, if you want to term it, bad speculation or concerning speculation that is done by market participants that have nothing to do with the actual spot market and the actual physical supply demand picture. Let's say pension funds, hedge funds, whatnot, piling into that market. And that ability is, of course, there with this whole financialization, not only of food markets, but essentially of everything that moves since the 1990s. Yeah. So that is there. That can lead to overshooting of prices to the upside, but also to the downside, mind you. But I wouldn't kind of put the sole blame on it or overemphasize it, right? We have a certain issue now that there are reduced supplies from Russia and especially Ukraine, and concerns regarding the future. Also regarding input factors, fertilizers, you mentioned fuels, right? Very important in the global food system. So that is there, but again, it is also an issue of food accessibility that has not gone away, and it has just been aggravated. And also we need to see, of course, there is a question of demand. We need to talk, okay, what about biofuel mandates? What about the fact that about 70% of global agricultural cultivated area is used for meat production, either as rangeland or to produce the respective feedstock? Yeah, and might it also be a good time, maybe that war, to start thinking about alternative food systems, maybe reducing meat consumption a tiny little bit. We don't need to become all vegetarians, but you know, my grandmother, she ate, we have it in German, the Sonntagsbraten. Well, they had once a week, they had meat, right? On Sundays. Otherwise, there are other things to eat. And actually, it might be more healthy.
Mm. Also, on another point where we may see similarities to the food crisis or the food price crisis 15 years ago, which was then triggered, or there were alarming signals when big exporters stopped exporting. And then basically afterwards, the lesson was, well, if we keep countries from doing that, from issuing export bans, then we may go through such a crisis in an okay manner, with all the international organizations being able to coordinate and help with that. Now, the fact that India 2 weeks ago announced that, well, first it announced that it will have enough for everybody who feels insecure in that market, but then announced that it will export, that it will ban exports because of its own current seasonal conditions and the heat, etc. Is that in this way not similar to back then, that this will never just be one country that stops exporting, but that may have a demonstrative effect on others, and others will also do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big worrying thing for food importers like in the Middle East, that something like 2007 and 2008 repeats itself. At that time, food exporters like Argentina, like India as well, like Russia, Vietnam, and so on, announced export restrictions out of concern for their own food security. Yeah? Although there was enough actually in the system at that time, and it was one reason why the InIIS platform was launched, right, to create more market transparency, more reliability, in order to avoid such export restrictions. And that is now a huge imperative, yeah, to avoid that these kind of export restrictions are mushrooming and spiraling out of control, and to maintain a certain liquidity in world market. That function as an assurance for food importers, because then when you see the panic buying kicking in, you will create the very phenomena you are trying to avoid by that panic buying, right? Like illiquid markets. There are illiquid markets, so you're trying to grab as much as you can, but as everybody's doing it, they will become even more illiquid. Prices are even going higher and so on. So in that sense, I think some sort of international coordination is very important. And you've mentioned the case of India. Yes, that was first Modi said India can feed the world. He was very self-confident. India had 5 bumper crops over the last 5 years. But now this year, that's not the case, right? There's a drought. And again, that reminds us of this big elephant in the room, climate change. and how it will affect future production. Also, the French harvest is coming in below expectations because of a drought. So that is really a major challenge, and was a major frustration, because some countries like Egypt actually were turning already to India and were kind of scouting possibilities whether India could replace exports from the Black Sea region. But that does not seem to be the case, or at least not as much as has been hoped for initially.
Mm. On one of those international organizational players, the World Food Programme, that organization already had enough to do, one would think, with the with feeding people in wars like in Syria, especially in the war in Yemen, and then in 2021, Afghanistan also entered the stage with a massive food crisis and weekly expectations that this and that many Afghan people may die from hunger, and so many million people being insecure. So now in this war, how could the World Food Programme help out to, rein in issue of prices of these global market conditions?
Well, they cannot affect the price, right? They are price takers. They will need to get the money to buy that wheat, or get in-kind donations to basically provide their services. And if they do not get it, then they will not provide their services, and people might die, as you've said.
Let's get back to the Middle East and North Africa in particular. Now, this is a region which is particularly hit by such price escalations. But why exactly are they so exposed and so weak on international food markets, would you say?
Well, it's a very arid region. So the Middle East as a whole has lost its ability to grow all its food needs from renewable water supplies in the 1970s already. And some water scarce regions like desert Libya or Palestine, Israel, in the 1950s already. You also have seen very substantial population growth, of course, in the region, which by now is going down, right? So people sometimes don't realize large parts of the MENA region are well ahead in a demographic transition. Some countries are now at or even below the replacement level in terms of the fertility rate. So below 2.1 children per woman, countries like Iran, like Turkey, like Lebanon, like Tunisia, and so on. So in a way, we are looking in the rearview mirror. So, but still, of course, it takes a while until this growth peters out, and strong cohorts of the population pyramid kind of migrate through the pyramid. So it will take a while. Even China still has population growth at this stage, although they have seen a very low fertility rate for a long time. So that is a challenge. Very arid, not enough water, and also considerable population growth, although declining now. Having said that, that's not necessarily, don't conflate or confound food insecurity with food lack of food self-sufficiency, right? The Middle East imports more than 50% of its calorie needs, yes, but so does Norway or Spain or Italy or Singapore and so on, So, and actually those countries in the Middle East that are the most import dependent, the Gulf countries, are the most food secure. Why? Well, they have the money in their pockets to pay for food imports. So what do you care whether that food is being imported or planted in your country? Okay, in a crisis might help, admittedly. We've mentioned these wars and the blockades and so on before. But under normal conditions, it's not an issue, and actually not an option. The Middle East cannot produce all that food it needs. So it has this vulnerability. Like Germany needs to import oil. You can drill for oil until you're blue in the face in the Bavarian mountains. There simply is no oil, right? So the same is true for food in the Middle East. So you simply have to live with that vulnerability and manage it.
On that debate, this is now you enter a huge debate between those in the food security versus those, for example, in the food sovereignty camp. So one gets an impression where you would position yourself in that, but the argument on the other side as well, if countries like Egypt were not exporting so and so much for exports or so, maybe that could alleviate this dependency to a certain extent.
Well, I mean, parts of the Middle East are major food exporters, not of cereals, but of vegetables and fruit. Actually, Turkey is one of the top 10 agricultural exporter nations globally. Much of the hazelnuts and the cherries and whatnot you will get in your supermarket will be from Turkey. Morocco is, I think, the top 5 producer of strawberries in the world. Tunisia has a very substantial export industry in olive oil. There are also some efforts to establish such export industries in Egypt, although it's in the overall scheme of things more limited. Egypt now with 100 million people, well, even if they cut back their strawberry production, it's not possible, right? There is this import dependence, you cannot avoid that. Of course, the food sovereignty movement also comes from the producer side, right? From the farmers, and that they essentially should be in a position to produce what they like in a way they think is conducive for their sustainable agriculture and also for their local diets that often differ, let's say, from increasingly uniform global and corporatized food system where everybody eats the same bag of cereals produced with the same reduced variety of crops. Yeah. So there are certain conflicts of interest, of course, also between, let's say, producers and small and medium-sized producers that really struggle in the global food system that is dominated by where the provision of input factors is very concentrated, and the distribution and processing channels are also very concentrated. And in the middle, you have this huge mass of small and medium-sized producers with very limited market power. Yeah? That then communicates with these two poles of the food system via market signals and prices that do not take the needs of the environment and the price, if you want to call it, of crucial factors like healthy soils or water and so on into consideration, which of course is might lead us to very troubling situations going ahead. And we see these issues already. The food system as we know it is not sustainable. At the same time, it's a difficult question how you want to provide food for 7 billion people otherwise, right? I mean, it is essentially industrial fertilizers that have put us in a position to be now at 7 billion people. Yeah? And some people like Václav Smil are very pessimistic that we would be able to provide the same amount of food with purely organic farming.
Understand. You've already referred to the role of the state in operating in these markets, that, you know, we need to have a state that is out there and doing policies that makes food more accessible. Now you refer to Egypt being out there and actively looking for new sources for importing its wheat or so. So that is one area where I would have to admit that some states are just more successful than others in operating in these markets. On the other side, in North Africa, in particular, policies to make food accessible have been policies of food subsidization. But that has also come under enormous stress because they've had to pay so much for, you know, mediating between these international prices for wheat and providing cheap flour and cheap and affordable bread for the population. So what outlook do you see for Tunisia and Egypt regarding their policies of food subsidization under these critical conditions as in the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, they do not have oil revenues, so they are a bit between a rock and a hard place. Countries like Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, well, oil prices have doubled, so what do they care? As long as food markets stay open and we do not have like export restrictions all across the board, they simply will pay more, but they will be able to source their food supplies. Also because their population size is more limited. Egypt, that's of course a huge market player on the demand side. So it's easier to source alternative supplies for a small country like Qatar than with a lot of petrodollars in their pockets than for a huge country like Egypt with limited fiscal means.
So back then, again, 15 years, you had the food price escalations, the food price crisis, and then a couple of years later, the outbreak of revolutionary episodes covering the whole of North Africa. And I don't know, regimes are under stress as they are already, especially especially Tunisian politics is very turbulent right now. What would you say? How does this new struggle over affordable and cheap bread kick into the existing contentious issues?
Well, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, right? And history doesn't repeat itself. So the fact that so many people now look to 2007 and 8 and make a connection with the Arab Spring, which might be a bit tenuous or a bit, like I'm not a friend of these mechanistic assumptions. So like there are certain buttons, and when the wheat price increases by XY%, the likelihood of unrest increases by Z% or so. Also, mind you, it's always the middle class is kind of revolting, or often, right? Or at least the leadership. And actually, people who are really under famine conditions often are, from political point of view, let's say from the capital, not so much of a problem, right? Why? Because they are so busy just surviving, they cannot organize politically. And at one point, they might be simply there might be a certain apathy as well, right? And they might be physically not able to revolt, right? So in a way, from a political regime survival perspective, probably a focus will be always a bit on or much more on your urban classes and certain segments of the urban classes. And that might be more the follow-on effects. They even if they do not suffer maybe famine, yeah. But they might need to cut their spending elsewhere, or their ambitions that they had, yeah, whatever, buying a smartphone or so. Well, such kind of follow-on effects also might be lead to considerable grievances.
Yeah, let's come back to one of those unexpected dynamics, right? Western countries, Europe, North America, were had all of their attention, one would assume rightly so, on issues of energy, like how to contain Russia's economic power through limiting them as suppliers with regard to oil and gas, which is complicated enough. But then after a couple of weeks, it became obvious that no, Russia stands also for something else that has this food power, so to speak, on international markets. Now, what would you say? Because I've read that Russia became this big exporter of wheat, etc., and such a strong actor in international food markets, is rather a recent phenomenon, right? It was not like that 20 years ago or so. So can that be rolled back, so to speak, similar to rolling back Russia as an overarching oil power?
Well, I mean, Russia used to be a major exporter in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Even in the 30s, actually, during the Ukraine famine, Ukraine was a food exporter, right? Stalin let those people die and exported the food in order to finance his industrialization program. Another example where it's about food accessibility, not about food availability necessarily. Yeah. So, yeah, but then the Soviet Union was a food net importer. So former Soviet Union states, most notably Russia and Ukraine, have only regained that position in the international market for cereals over the past 2 decades or so. Well, can that or should that even be rolled back, right? I mean, they have very good conditions to produce wheat there. So hopefully, the answer is rather no, right? I mean, if you take a look at the global stage, there is not that much available land bank or coupled with available water resources left. Yeah, Africa, you have some areas, yes, with an economic water shortage, also an ability maybe not to grow wheat, but other cereals, yeah, rice or so, or local varieties, sorghum, cassava, and so on. Again, that leads to a question: how should this global food system organize? Should we simply replace that wheat, or should we rather look at this food system that is a bit more localized, also more diverse in terms of diets and varieties, cater also to domestic preferences more, and maybe, as I've said, has less orientation towards meat, or an expansion of meat consumption that is currently assumed. Yeah, so I think you can replace some of it within reason, but you should. I don't think it's necessarily desirable. Yeah. To push it back. Actually, also you need to see with climate change. Actually, some of these northern latitudes actually will be able to expand production, right? Which is a kind of like in Canada or in Russia, while the tropical belt, the production capacity will be particularly affected. So it will rather get worse, yeah, than the reliance on these latitudes than less.
I understand. So can anything be done to contain this food crisis then at all?
The food power of Russia is, of course, considerable in terms of exports, but also in terms of provision of input factors. And Russia continues to export, mind you. The real problem is the kind of reduction of Ukrainian exports, because the port of Odessa is being blocked, and the reduction of its harvest as a result of the war impact. In the short term, I don't see a possibility to avoid this shortfall. In the medium term, there is a possibility that other regions might, other production regions globally, react to higher prices, produce more. We will need to see how much of that will materialize. In 2007, 2008, after the global food crisis, we saw a market reaction like that and increased production. This time we will need to see, because the margins of farmers have not necessarily increased, because along higher grain prices we've also seen a very substantial increase in fuel and fertilizer prices. The Russian side is blaming the reduced exports to Western sanctions, so a kind of war of narratives is developing here. The West blaming the Russian war for impacts of global food security, and Russia blaming Western sanctions. There is a certain impact of Western sanctions. Food is formally excluded from the sanctions, but indirectly, of course, there's less trade finance available. The insurance premia are rising, so that can impede exports, and also input provision, for example, potash fertilizer exports from Belarus have decreased very significantly as a result of sanctions. So what the West can do in the short term is to maintain kind of open windows within the sanctions regime for exports of food and crucial input factors. It can push for an opening of the port of Odessa, but I think the chances here are slim. Putin has clearly shown his willingness to weaponize food supplies and will continue to do so. And in the middle run, we will need to see how much of a market reaction will be there to pick up the slack or the shortfall that has been caused as a result of the war impact. Another possibility is also to reduce demand, for example, by reduced biofuel mandates.
Well, thank you, Eckart, for these nice and insightful illustrations of the place of food in the world, and which is mostly taken for granted, and then you see it unfold so critically in events like war or so, and that is why many are so overwhelmed with these issues and topics. And I think this was a great way to respond to that, and to have somebody like you explain these dynamics to us. So thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. All the best to Bremen.
All right. The same goes for Hamburg, of course. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.